The Egyptian Code and the Mystery of 10,500 BC, about 12,500 years ago. And this is with, of course, the research and study by Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock. Robert Bauval's 2008 book, The Egypt Code, and in his typical meticulously researched style, has set out to prove the theory that the ancient Egyptians built their pyramids on the Memphite necropolis not in a random haphazard fashion, but to reflect the cosmos in order to unite heaven and earth. And the writer is Brandon West from Project Global Awakening. He says, I will present the core ideas and evidence from Robert Bauval's book, The Egypt Code, that validate the existence of a high civilization that existed on this earth around 12,000 years ago. This is important because, for one, it is essential that we understand the truth of our history and the truth of human origins. If there indeed was a high civilization on this earth 12,000 years ago, capable of fantastic feats of architecture, engineering, and science, how would that change our perception of ourselves? And secondly, there is a lot of ancient knowledge and wisdom that the ancient Egyptians possessed which we have forgotten, and in the words of Robert Bauval from the Egypt Code, page 187, he writes, I hope that the new generation of Egyptologists will come to see, as I did, that ancient Egypt is not a defunct civilization to be studied in a dispassionate way, but rather a cultural model that is very much alive and needs to be understood, with perhaps some of its principles put again into practice for the benefit of mankind. Now, what we're concerned about here, more or less, is the origin of the myth that Egypt was made in image of heaven, and in his book, The Egypt Code, Robert Bauval equates this with the creation myth of Heliopolis, where they give the genealogy of the pantheon of gods and how their interactions created heaven, the earth, the air, and so on. On page 44, he concludes, this is probably where the idea came from that the image of the sky had been imprinted on the land and made Egypt the image of heaven. Not only that, not only was it imprinted in Egypt, but also in Greece, in ancient Greece. The cities of the Peloponnese, for example, are all the image of stars above, constellations above. Now, but here says, but what if the origin of that myth was not actually a myth, but at all but architectural in origin? And what if it was actually much more ancient? What if it was a memory that had been passed on to future generations, and that it had been mythologized once the meaning of the memory had been forgotten by some, maybe even the majority? This is what I believe is to be the case, and let us begin with the pyramids, the writer says. The mystery of the pyramids, it's almost unanimously accepted by scholars that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built around the date of 2500 BC. This is based on the assumption that Khufu built this great monument, which places it nicely during the peak of Pyramid Age in Egypt, when it is undeniable that the Egyptians undertook a massive pyramid building project. Yet there are some idiosyncrasies. No other pyramid in Egypt comes close to the Great Pyramid, especially the ones which we know were built during the Pyramid Age, many of which have been reduced to a pile of rubble today. There is also the unexplained fact that it appears as if the building skill of the ancient Egyptians declined over time instead of improved, and yet the Great Pyramid still stands, even though its outer layer of white limestone was mined off to build the city of Cairo. It remains today virtually unaffected. Not to mention the fact that the ancient Egyptians themselves never claim to have built the Great Pyramid. There is only one piece of evidence which Egyptologists use to date the pyramid to 2500 BC, and it is a cartouche of Khufu's name that was written on the wall in red ochre paint in an isolated little space within the Great Pyramid that we had to use dynamite to blast our way into. Nowhere else in the entire pyramid is there a single inscription, except in this space that was enclosed even before the pyramid was fully completed. This, to me, is suggestive of the fact that the ancient Egyptians never even got inside the Great Pyramid simply because, as we know, they put inscriptions on everything and about everything. So basically, the official story of the dating of the pyramid is that we allegedly know it was built around 2500 BC because of an alleged original cartouche painted on the wall, not even inscribed, in a room that the builders would have fully believed that no one would have ever entered again. That to me sounds as flaky as the official 9/11 story. Perhaps the same people were behind it. The other pieces of evidence that admittedly is much more convincingly dates the Great Pyramid to 2500 BC was uncovered by Robert Bauval. He discovered that the southern shaft in the king's chamber points to the stars of Orion's belt as they were in 2500 BC, Graham Hancock's quest for the lost civilization, Heaven's Mirror. This is far more convincing evidence that it could have been built then, but yet it still does not resolve the fact that the Egyptians never claimed to have built the Great Pyramid, and that a star map is created on the ground by the Giza pyramid specifically indicating the year 11,541 BC, as we shall see, as well as the simple fact that these pyramids were beyond Egypt's level of technology at the time, as they are probably even beyond our level of technology today. This should, if we are open-minded, lead us to at least consider that it was built in an earlier time. An older date for the pyramids? Robert Bauval in Egypt Code, page 33, writes, the 5th century BC historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. The Egyptians themselves went a lot further. They claimed that their sacred river had its source among the stars. In Robert Bauval's book, The Egypt Code, in his meticulously researched style, he provides a lot of highly persuasive evidence that the Egyptians built their pyramids in the Memphite necropolis to reflect the heavens, and he realized that when observing the Memphite necropolis from a northerly perspective, specifically from an ancient site known as Letopolis, he found that while looking south along the Nile, some of the major ancient sites would have created a star map with the Nile symbolically representing the Milky Way. The Egypt Code, page 106. The city of Heliopolis would have been closest to this vantage point, south and to the left of the Nile, which, as he shows in his book, was an ancient cult center that revolved around the stars, but also later around the sun god Ra. He further provides convincing evidence, the Egypt Code, page 79 to 95, that Ra was later coalesced with the stellar god Horakhti, or Horus of the horizon, who was often symbolized as a recumbent lion, merging to create the deity Ra Horakhti, or Ra Horus of the horizon. In Robert Bauval's own words, Egypt Code, page 85, being such attentive observers of the constellations to the point of obsession, it would be very odd indeed if the priests of Heliopolis did not take particular notice of the lion-shaped constellation that housed the sun at this time of year, and which was the perfect metaphor for Ra Horakhti, the merger of Ra with the cosmic lion. Therefore, Heliopolis would have represented the constellation Leo in the sky, further south to the right, west of the Nile. This time we have the Great Pyramids of Giza, which clearly are aligned to represent Orion in the sky. Curiously, they are in the right alignment in accordance with the Nile, as well to reflect the relationship between the Milky Way and the Orion constellation in the sky. Then further south again, on the right west of the Nile, we have the small cluster of Abusir pyramids, which would represent the Pleiades constellation, creating a sky map on the ground with a triangular relationship of Leo, Orion, Pleiades, all accounted for on the ground and all located in sync with the Nile to represent the Milky Way. The only thing is that at 2500 BC, the Nile, which runs south-north, would have been perpendicular to the Milky Way in the sky, which would have been parallel with the horizon at the time. This is where things get interesting, and where Robert Bauval courageously and admirably follows the evidence, even though it breaks away from the convention. Was there a time when the Milky Way would have been running in a north-south direction in the sky so that it was in alignment with the Nile? and so that this star was a mirror image of the heavens instead of an image that had to be rotated 90 degrees for it to be a match. Robert Bauval believes so. Star map of Memphis necropolis. Based off the Celtic cycles which relate to the ancient Egyptian calendar, which played an important role in the Egypt code, by which it's unfortunately beyond the scope of the article, Robert Bauval turned back to the heavens which change over time due to the phenomenon called precession of the equinoxes, to arrive to the date of 11,541 BC. The amazing thing is that on that date of 11,541 BC, the Milky Way would have actually been turned 90 degrees compared to how it appears in 2,500 BC. And this time, instead of running perpendicular with the Nile, it runs parallel with the Nile and perpendicular to the horizon, actually giving the appearance that the Milky Way, the cosmic river, is flowing directly into the Nile River. Thus, when the Egyptians claimed that their Nile was sourced in the stars, this was not merely myth, this was a direct reference to a much older date when it actually looked as if this was the case, albeit from an imaginative and poetic perspective. Amazingly, when we observe the stars in the alignment of the pyramids from this vantage point, the two brightest stars of Orion make an angle of 43 degrees 20 minutes with a north-south meridian, and the two largest pyramids of Giza, Khufu's and Khafre's, also make an angle of 43 degrees 20 minutes with a north-south meridian, and they are both positioned to the left of the Nile Milky Way. A perfect star map on the ground. Moreover, Heliopolis, which as we have seen was dedicated to Ra, which was sometimes symbolized as a lion, would have mirrored on the ground the location of the constellation of Leo, and the pyramids of Abu Sir were in the correct location, although not perfect, to represent the Pleiades star cluster. In the words of Robert Bauval, page 184 of the Egypt Code, controversial as this may at first seem, we have also seen how, when the sky is precessed at 11,451 BC, that the three stars of Orion are alleged along the meridian with the three pyramids of Giza, the image of Zep Tepi in the sky, the triangular region of Orion Pleiades Leo, bears an uncanny resemblance to the image of Zep Tepi on the ground, the triangular region of Giza Memphis Heliopolis. Now, in the Egypt Code, Robert Bauval provides this as solid evidence that the ancient Egyptians built their pyramids on the Memphite necropolis according to the master plan to reflect the image of heaven in Egypt, thus fulfilling the belief that Egypt was made in the image of heaven, as we discussed at the beginning of the article. I agree, the writer says, with Robert Bauval wholeheartedly. In part, it's clear that during the Pyramid Age, which comprised the 3rd to 6th dynasties between 2686 to 2181 BC, the ancient Egyptians did embark on a zealous pyramid building project, and the evidence strongly suggests that they built according to a master plan to mirror the heavens in Egypt. After all, how could all of those alignments be chalked up to coincidence? But is there not another explanation? An ancient legacy from Zep Tepi. As I've explained previously, and not in very much detail as I could write a whole article based off the scientifically advanced and mysterious nature of the Great Pyramid, I do not believe that it was built around 2500 BC, and I believe the evidence supports this. Even if we look at this truly groundbreaking and ingenious theory that Robert Bauval has proposed, there are a couple of things that don't sit right with me. Namely, the fact that Giza pyramids are aligned to a single arc minute to perfectly reflect the constellation of Orion as it appeared in 11,451 BC, whereas Heliopolis and Abu Sir pyramids are much less exact and are merely built in the right places so that they resemble the location of the stars, but not the exact alignment as with the Giza pyramids. Robert Bauval said himself of Heliopolis and the Abu Sir pyramids, admittedly the match is not mathematically perfect due to the bedrock realities of geography and topography. The issue is, whereas the other sites are not mathematically perfect, it's clear that everything about the Great Pyramid and other Giza pyramids for that matter are mathematically perfect, and it seems to me that if it was true pyramid builders' intention to build more pyramids from the start, I believe the builders would have moved mountains not only to make it reality but to make it perfect. For they clearly show us that it was within their capability, given the fact that they quite literally built the mountain, and that meticulous planning and surveying certainly went into engineering and constructing of these monuments. From everything to do with its architecture all the way to the greater cosmic alignments it represents, the Great Pyramid is nearly perfect, and maybe it once was. This suggests to me that it was the work of an entirely different civilization, and a more advanced civilization at that. I think that the reason why the ancient Egyptian pyramid builders built their pyramids according to this master plan, and the origin of the myth that Egypt was made in the image of heaven, have a common source. The evidence suggests, however unlikely or against our preconceptions it may be, that the Giza pyramids were built in or around 11,541 BC in the specific alignment to commemorate the stars at that time, which is most probably the origin of the myth that Egypt was made in the image of heaven. I believe that ancient myth that Egypt was built in the image of heaven has referred to these pyramids of great antiquity, and that this tradition was transmitted orally through each generation, and that the pyramid age of centering roughly around 2500 BC was an attempt to continue to the work that was started much earlier by a race of gods, to the Egyptian mind anyways, in the legendary first time which Robert Bouval has shown us has been fixed in the time by these massive stone monuments, no matter which way we look at it. The question is there any proof? And I would say yes. Hereditary knowledge. The ancient astronomer priest did hold advanced and to their minds truly sacred knowledge of the movement of the stars and the heavenly cycles, as is commonly accepted. But what if they held another type of knowledge as well? Ancient knowledge. Ancient knowledge, the likes of which the Egyptian priest who Solon, Plato's ancestor, refers to when he says to Solon, Egyptian priest, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are all children, and there's no such thing as an old Greek." Solon, what do you mean by that? Egyptian priest, you are all young in mind, and you have no belief rooted in old tradition, and no knowledge with age. And the reason is this: with you and others, writing and other necessities of civilization have only just been developed when the periodic scourge of the deluge descends and spares none but the unlettered and the uncultured, so that you have to begin again like children in complete ignorance of what happened in earlier times. You remember only one deluge, though there have been many. This is from Timaeus and Critias, page 35 to 36. Now, the veracity of Plato's claims have been called into question, and rightly so. We should never believe anything completely just because it was claimed by someone or written somewhere, even if it was Plato who said it. But the interesting thing is that there is supporting scientific evidence and mythical evidence from another ancient culture, both of which identify the same dates for the global flood, and the claim that there have been many floods. The more ancient flood myth is from India. It is in the Kumari Kandum myths, which are the myths about an ancient advanced civilization that existed more than 10,000 years ago in India, who built great centers for learning, and in general is very reminiscent of the Atlantis myth. Graham Hancock explores this in detail in his phenomenal book Underworld, The Mysterious Origins of Civilization. The first great deluge took place 16,000 BC. The second one occurred 14,058 BC, when parts of Kumari Kandam went under the sea. The third one happened 9,564 BC, when a large part of Kumari Kandam was submerged. Coincidentally, the dates given in Kumari Kandam myth for the last deluge closely matched the date that Plato, and thus the Egyptian priest, gives Solon for the inundation of the civilization of Atlantis. According to the Egyptian priest, Atlantis was inundated around 9,600 BC. The fact that these ancient cultures have myths which identify that specific date is highly intriguing and at least increases their credibility. But astonishingly, not only does modern science identify a very similar time frame for global superflood that occurred right around that date. Science also predicts that were in fact 3 global superfloods, just like the Kumari Kandum myth states, occurring roughly between the approximate time bands 15,000, 14,000 years ago, 12 to 11,000 years ago, 8 to 7,000 years ago. These dates are given to us by the work of Professor John Shaw from the University of Alberta. And as it can be seen clearly, the Egyptian priest dates of 9,500 BC lies right in the middle of the period for the global superflood, which is given to us by science. Now, the point of all this in relationship to the age of the pyramids is merely to prove the validity of the statements made by the Egyptian priest, and thus how he specifically says that the Egyptian culture is many thousands of years old, with written records extending back 8,000 years, and knowingly hoary with age. Now that we've seen that the priest's date of the global flood was true, and that the occurrence of multiple floods, we must accept that the rest of his claims also have at least some truth to them. I support my Patreon account if they are not entirely truthful. Thus, as an ancient Egyptian priest states clearly, there was much ancient knowledge passed on within the Egyptian priesthood, and then at such a time that they were either instructed to act on the knowledge, or that they decided that it was time they could have in their possession as advisor to the king and pharaohs, enlighten them of this knowledge in the cosmic alignment within Egypt, and urged him to act on it. It would not have taken much convincing, considering the glory in the eyes of man and the gods that the pharaohs would have gained to participate in this work. Therefore, based on the evidence at hand, that which I have provided here, the writer says, and that which is beyond the scope of this article, we should at least consider the possibility that the pyramids of Giza were built around the date 11,451 BC by an ancient and as yet lost civilization. And it was these specific pyramids and their alignment with the Nile, and thus the cosmos, which gave birth to the idea that Egypt was made in the image of heaven. It may have been this knowledge and the pyramids themselves which spurred the ancient Egyptians into the massive pyramid building project that was the Pyramid Age. And this is on Solask. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Finally, support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.